Hello, my name's Hannah. I'm a clinical psychologist and an associate with Homestart, and this is a short video about understanding the brain. We know that the brain is incredibly complex, and this is a way of explaining things in a simple way which parents can often find really helpful. So we can use our hand as a model of the brain. In this model, my palm and my wrist here represent the brain stem. So the brain stem is responsible for things like our breathing, our heart rate, temperature control, appetite, things like that. Things that are very much out of our conscious awareness, our brain stem is doing them in the background. Then we have, represented by my thumb, right in the middle of our brain here, the limbic system and the amygdala. Now, this is the emotional centre of our brain, where our feelings are processed, and also where attachment happens. So it's very much a feeling part of our brain. And our fight, flight, freeze response happens in this lower region of the brain. Our threat response, our response to stressors and things we find threatening in our environment. So some people call this part of the brain the oh no brain or the muddle brain, and we're going to think a little bit more about the threat response in a little bit. And then wrapping over the top here, we have our cortex, represented by my hand and my fingers coming around here. The cortex is responsible for thinking and language. Sometimes people call it the thinking brain. And an especially important part of the cortex is the prefrontal cortex. And it's represented by my middle knuckles here and my fingernails. This part of the brain is just behind our forehead. And it's highly interconnected with the rest of the brain. You can see it's well positioned to integrate with other regions in the brain, and that allows it to integrate lots of different parts of our experience and the functions of other parts of the brain. So a lot of our executive functions and our self-regulation happens here in the prefrontal cortex. It helps us to think things through flexibly and control our impulses. And being close to the limbic system, you can see it's just resting on the top of it here, is important for its function to help us with self-soothing and having empathy with others. So those functions are all happening in this little region of the brain here, which is just behind our forehead. The brain develops through networks of connections forming in response to our experiences. When we're first born, we have all of the neurons, or that's brain cells, that we need, but they're not yet connected up into these networks of connections. And that's especially true in the cortex. It's a bit like if you imagine forming a pathway through a field of grass. When the first person walks across the field, you might be able to see where the grass is a bit flattened, but it's not really a path yet. But the more people that use it, the more it might become a visible pathway as the grass dies away. And if it's really useful, perhaps someone comes along and puts some paving down and makes a definite pathway across the field. And the brain is a little bit like that. Pathways of networks that are used lots get stronger and stronger and stronger the more they're used, and they become more and more robust pathways within the brain. Conversely, if you imagine that field of grass, if people stop using it, then gradually the grass might grow back, the undergrowth might encroach, and eventually you might not be able to tell there was ever a pathway there at all. And that's a little bit like pruning within the brain. So when pathways within the brain are not used very much, the brain prunes them away gradually. That makes the brain more efficient because we only keep the connections which, based on our experiences, we're likely to keep needing. So strong early neural pathways provide a solid foundation for future pathways. And basic capabilities provide the foundation for more complex ones. There's a particular sequence. So, for example, sight and hearing develop first, followed by language and speech production, and with more complex functions following and building on those that have gone before. So the brain develops from the back to the front, from the bottom to the top, and from the inside out. So the prefrontal cortex is the last part of the brain to reach maturity, and current estimates are that it gets to maturity at around the age of 25 years. So there's a lot of developing going on, and our brains are very underdeveloped when we're first born. So let's now think a little bit about the implications of the structure and development of the brain for our threat response and how we soothe ourselves. So when we are well regulated, we are able to think clearly and flexibly, connect with others, be curious and open, integrate different parts of our experience, and emotionally regulate ourselves or self-soothe. And that's mainly due to the activities of the prefrontal cortex. We sometimes talk about being calm and connected in this state. When we tip into our threat response, and that might be because of something threatening happening in our environment or something we perceive as threatening, or it might be because of lots of smaller stresses building up, the prefrontal cortex goes offline. We sometimes call it flipping our lids, as it's as if the prefrontal cortex is no longer in connection with our downstairs brain, and the downstairs brain is in control. And we might feel either rigid or chaotic. We're not able to think clearly, we're not able to think flexibly, and we're not able to learn when we're in this state. This process of flipping our lids and our neocortex going offline makes absolute sense in terms of our evolution. So what we are talking about here is our fight, flight, freeze response. And some people have talked about other Fs to do with our threat response as well. So our brain has decided that something in our environment is threatening, is posing a danger to us, and we either need to run away, that's the flight response, to fight that thing that's threatening us, that's the fight response, or to freeze and assess it, or maybe even to play dead to try and escape this threat. So it's all about protection and safety. Complex thought, reasoning, empathy, all of those things are not a priority. Our survival is our priority when we're in our threat response. So young brains might be more easily dysregulated and go into the threat response more quickly. They don't have a fully developed cortex and prefrontal cortex to help them with things like soothing, empathy, impulse control, problem solving. So they need adults to act as their neocortex for them, helping to soothe them, both helping to prevent them going into their threat response and also to get them back into a state of calm when they do flip their lids. And gradually, through the repeated experience of other people helping them with regulating in this way, they'll become more and more able to do it for themselves as their cortex develops all of those wonderful connections helping them to do it. People who've experienced trauma may be more likely to flip their lids or go into their threat response more quickly. They might have a particularly sensitive threat response and a much lower threshold to responding to any sign of potential threat. Whenever any of us are in our threat response, we need to be able to get to a more regulated state, to more of a state of calm, before we will be able to think things through and before we'll be able to take on new information. It's not possible to think flexibly and use our prefrontal cortex when our prefrontal cortex is offline and we're in a state of threat.